I'm going to be sharing some Inktense tips and my experimenting with using an airbrush with Inktense. Make sure to stick around till the end of the video where I will be giving you some updates on my adventures with watercolor. No, it is not the same as Inktense. For those of you who are members over on Patreon, make sure to head over there where you've got the 1 hour and 20-minute version of this demonstration available for you now. If you are unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to all of my weekly 1 to 2, sometimes 3-hour-long demonstrations, in addition to all the over 200 already there now. If you're not sure if Patreon is going to be a fit for you, I've got a link to my video library where you can see what is available there, and there is a free colored pencil demonstration as well. For this one, I drew everything out with a water-soluble graphite pencil, and then I started lining it, and I did this on a live stream. I'll have a card pop up where you can check that out, how I use the Inktense blocks like the same as I would with a watercolor pan to start lining everything out with this deep plum color. The reason that I do this with the Inktense, and this is a big difference between Inktense and watercolor. Inktense is water-soluble ink, whereas watercolor is watercolor. They're two different mediums. But with the Inktense, when this mixture dries, and I'm using the Inktense blocks just like I would a watercolor pan where I mix water into it and then can paint that on directly to the paper. But when the Inktense dries, it is permanent. This isn't moving, and you'll see this as I start to glaze and layer on top of it. None of this is going to smudge out. Whereas if I had done the same thing with watercolor, watercolor can reactivate, and that can make this start to smudge and bleed a little bit if you layer a lot over it and really brush that area out. So that's going to be one of the bigger differences in practice when working with Inktense versus watercolor. This is permanent when it's dry. Now, I typically, when working with Inktense, I prefer to do everything or get at least my base layers down with the Inktense blocks first, where I'm painting it on like this. That is not going to really reactivate, whereas if you apply the color directly to the paper with just the Inktense pencil, you're more likely to have that not completely blend out when you add water to it, so it may leave a little bit more smudging when you put your next layer. And we'll talk about that more later in this video. So for this section, I wanted to try making a mixture and airbrushing it and seeing how this would go. So I took my Inktense block and an X-Acto knife, and I just made shavings into a little cup and then added water to it until I had the consistency what felt similar to what I would have with my actual airbrush paint. So Derwent does sell a little grater that would make this way easier. I just keep forgetting to order it every time I place an order for art supplies. And I just placed a huge order, which you'll see at the end of the video, on stuff, and yet again, forgot to get that grater. So I'm just gonna shave a bunch of this in here, and I put it in this little cup. You can get these little cups over, oh, knock it over, I'm really graceful here. You can get these little cups at the art supply store, usually pretty close to wherever they're storing the paints. So I'm gonna spray water into this and let that dissolve. And it dissolved pretty well. I did stir it with a paintbrush, but it did dissolve pretty well on its own like that. And I pre-mixed a couple of different colors that I knew I was going to want to use in the sky. So now with the airbrush, I'm using my Grex airbrush, and the big difference I noticed airbrushing with the Inktense versus actual airbrush paint, the Inktense doesn't dry right away. I mean, it's just water that is thinning that. And so you're more likely to have it kind of puddle up, whereas with the airbrush paint, I usually use Goldens or Holbein. Those dry pretty much as soon as they hit the paper. So that was definitely a difference here, and something that I had to watch for, and every so often would have to stop, take a hairdryer to it, get that to dry before I continued layering. Otherwise, it did really start to want to puddle up. I also found that it would cause the paper to warp just a bit, whereas airbrush paper or airbrush paint, you really never see any warping. I mean, it dried, once I went over it with the hairdryer, it dried back flat, but that just kind of shows you how much more water is used to get this the right consistency with Inktense versus with the airbrush paint. So a big difference there. Another thing that I noticed when trying to airbrush this background is that it was very splattery. You can see little dots there, a lot of little splattery dots. Not terrible, it's not something that I felt ruined the piece, but it is something that looked very different than what I would have gotten had I airbrushed that. Now, I could have just used airbrush paint. I could have done this as a mixed medium. That is something you can definitely do with Inktense and airbrush. And I think the results I kind of would have liked a little better. It would have been easier to work with, I guess. I shouldn't say that the results would have been that different other than the little minor splattering, but the pigment tends to come out a little, it's easier to control anyway, I think, with the airbrush. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And you could do this as a mixed media where you used your regular airbrush paint in the background and then Inktense for the foreground. But in this case, this was an experiment that I wanted to try both or try it with this and see how that worked. I'll probably try it a few more times just to see if it's something that I can master, maybe use a little bit less water and see how that goes. But it was definitely an interesting experiment, and I wouldn't say it was a failure. It just isn't as good as airbrush paint. And I'm going to slowly build that up into the darker values. And I just wanted an out of focus cloud scene here. This did save a lot of time though, so while I'm saying how it would have been a bit easier using real airbrush paint, let me tell you, oh my gosh, this saved so much time versus where I normally would just be trying to brush that, and I would not have gotten that same look. If I tried getting these blurry out of focus clouds with regular brush work, it would not have come out this soft. Airbrushing has a very unique look that you really can't get easily with many different mediums. With oils, it's fairly easy with wet into wet, but with most mediums, airbrushing just has a very, very unique look to it. So I used this for some of the base layers too. I figured I had enough paint mixed, may as well use that for the base on some stuff that I knew was going to be a similar color. Airbrushing some on the moon, got some of my succulents that are growing on the moon. Now this is a huge difference in how I would approach watercolor versus Inktense. With, like I said before, with the watercolor, if I were to go on top of those lines, they really would have smudged out a lot more than what you're seeing here. So that gives me a really nice base. And I can just loosely brush over all of this. It saves a ton of time. That's one of my favorite things about working with Inktense. It's a fairly fast medium to work in. Now for the tiny details, I do like using my Inktense pencils, but I can get even smaller details with a liner brush and just using those Inktense blocks like I would a watercolor pan, where you make that ink mixture and then you can get those tiny, tiny details. I like using both the Inktense pencils and blocks together, but I'm asked this all the time, if you could only choose one, what would I go with? Hands down the blocks. And that's just because the blocks I feel are a little bit more versatile as far as getting small lines versus thick lines. You can see I can switch the brush size to get bigger lines or use a smaller brush to get smaller lines. So you've got a little bit more variation there than what you're going to get with the pencils alone. But ideally, I like working with them both together. They really complement each other nicely. I would say I use my blocks more in a piece than the pencils too. So this reference photo for the red panda, if you would like to paint this yourself, that came from wildlifereferencephotos.com. So you can purchase the photos there if that is something that interests you. I'm not associated with them or anything. I just purchase a lot of really good reference photos from them. So onto the red, I'm using a lot of this kind of plum and magenta color. Anytime you see me using oranges, or in this case, a raw sienna type tone, you're gonna see me using a lot of purples and magentas. Those colors just look great together. Don't always jump to black for your darker shadows, or if you know you need a shadow. Say, I'm a fan of using black paint. I know a lot of people aren't. I love it, but I'm gonna save it for my deepest, darkest shadows, and then even then, that's a little bit redundant. Even then, I'm going to be mixing some purples and magentas or blues or something into it. Like right there, there is some black, but I'm going to mix other colors over it and into it so it doesn't come out really flat. But notice how when I put the majority of the shadows in there, I started with purples and violets first. If you try to blend the black into the reddish browns or the yellows, it doesn't always come out looking so cute. Sometimes it works, but you're always safer to try the purples first. Purples and magentas, I should say. So here I am using some black. It's got a little bit of purple mixed in there. Now remember with the Inktense, this is going to be very different than the watercolor. And that here, if I had done that with watercolor and I have a harsh line and it dries, you can rework that area to blend it out. With Inktense, when it dries, you've got a harsh line. That is going to stay put. So that is something to be aware of. Make sure you blend that out before it dries, if that is something that you need an area to be very soft. With the watercolor, I could have super harsh edges where I didn't finish blending an area and I came back later. Just add water, it reactivates, and you can smooth that out. And it's not so much an issue of makes one medium better than the other. It's just a difference you want to be aware of. Sometimes I find one to be more convenient than the other, but it's not a definite. I would say it's watercolor is always better because you can blend out, or Inktense is always better because it will stay put. It just depends on what you're doing, and you want to be aware that that is a difference. Now, it's totally normal to have your initial stages be really messy like this. Just don't leave them there. But don't be afraid when your work has these that is a very ugly stage where you look at it and go, oh, good job, Lisa. You're well practiced in this medium, aren't you? It's normal to look like that. We're going to come back through and clean all of that up. So getting a base on all of the succulents, and this is going to be the same thing. We'll come back through, add shading and highlights, and get all of that detailing, cleaning up edges. All of that will be done later. Now, usually I would recommend, with most areas in your Inktense, start light and work your way to darker. That is going to be easier in most cases. There are a few exceptions where I'll come back on top with my white highlights and then go back over that. But more often than not, you're going to make your life a lot easier if you start with your lighter values and then add darks on top. The paint, or the ink I should say, is very translucent, so you're going to see what's underneath it. And of course, the more water that you add, the more translucent it is going to be. So as I move back into the grass here, I'm adding a lot more water where I just want a hint of that green. It's the same green I used in the foreground. I just used a lot more water. And then I build up to the darker blades of grass as I move forward. Now here I'm using the white Inktense pencil to get some of these highlights. Now the Inktense pencil with the white, when you blend it out, it doesn't stay as opaque as the white Inktense block. If you want something to be really bright, really white, use the Inktense block like you would a watercolor pan, where you're mixing water in with it and painting that where you want it to go. As you apply that, it's going to look like it's very translucent and not opaque enough. When it dries really opaque. Here, where I'm using the white, if I blend this out with water, it's going to make it'll dry a bit more translucent. So it's kind of the reverse there. I'm using a water brush. This is the Derwent water brushes. They're probably my favorite water brushes. Water is held in the back of that, and you just squeeze it a little bit to let some of the water come forward. I always dab it on a paper towel before I hit the paper, though, just to make sure I don't have too much. I'm going to repeat that same thing here. Paying attention to some of the lights and the darks. Now the Inktense pencils, the majority of these are going to come out darker than what you would expect. Like if I wanted to do a blue outline, like you see me do quite often, that lighter blue, the Inktense pencil is not going to do that for me. It comes out very, very dark. When you add water, that can lighten it up, but it's not going to be like I would do with colored pencils, where I can take a light blue pencil and go around the edges and it actually makes it light blue. If I do that with the Inktense pencil, it's going to come out darker. So if I want something to be very light with the blue, which I'll do later, I'm going to do that with the Inktense block, applying that directly to the paper. And that's one of few times that I will take that Inktense block and apply it directly to the paper. In almost every case, I'm using the Inktense blocks like watercolor pans, where I'm mixing an ink mixture with a brush and water and then painting that on the paper. When you use the Inktense blocks directly on the paper, it comes out very grainy, very gritty. Sometimes that can be a really cool look. But if you wanted something smooth, you're going to want to mix water in with that ink mixture and then paint it onto the paper first. Even when you reactivate, if you take that block, scribble around in an area or shade that in on the paper, and then you go over it with water, it smooths it out some, but it still will stay fairly grainy, kind of gritty. So it's kind of cool if you're trying to get, let's say, a stone background. It will give you a really cool look. So there are times that will look amazing. But in a case like this, where I want everything to be more smooth, it works out better if I go ahead and paint that on separately first. and then go on top of it with my pencils. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to get finer details with a paintbrush than with what I will with a pencil. So I come in through everything with the pencils, and then tiny, tiny details, I'll go back and use the Inktense blocks and mix with a paintbrush and water and then paint that on for the littlest areas. Now I'm going to create some really over-exaggerated holes in the moon, or craters, I guess we should say. I do recommend having a scratch piece of paper next to you when you're working with Inktense, because sometimes what those pencil marks look like when they're wet versus dry, completely different. Like the color can be, as you see here, very, very different. And I've had a few times where I did that and I was quite surprised with the results I got. So I like to usually scribble. Even the colors on the back of the pencil are not super accurate. And a lot of it just depends on how much water you added, and are you putting it over white paper or are you putting it over other colors? You just get different results. So it's always good to have that little scratch paper to test. So here I am using the white Inktense block, and this is where I'm applying it directly to the paper and letting it stay with that semi-grainy, gritty look. And you can really see those little bumps. That's what I'm talking about there. Now the Inktense blocks break really, really easily. That's not a problem. I break them on purpose because they're easier to handle. I don't want mine to be in a full set. I've had people ask if they should return their blocks when they're broken. I mean, you could, but when I work with them, I'm going to break them on purpose anyway. I'd rather them be in pieces than one whole block. It's just awkward to hold when it's one piece. And again, once you start adding pressure, it's going to snap anyway. So that white that you saw me using a second ago, that was one that I had broken into pieces on purpose. I guess I should add that bit of information. I'm using some purples and blues for the shading here in the grass, getting that a bit darker. I'm going to use that white Inktense pencil, and now this is the only pencil that will lighten things up. Where I was talking about earlier, like if I use the light blue and went around it, it's just going to come out dark blue. The white will lighten things up. And I usually put that in areas I'm not planning to do a lot of blending with water, or I lose those lines. Now I'm starting to refine the hair. You want to build this in clumps and clusters. A common mistake, one I made for many years when I first started painting, was that you think with hair, just draw in a bunch of individual strands and it'll look like fur or hair. No, it just looks like weird confetti. You want to pay attention to your reference photo. Which direction does the fur move? How long or short is the fur in that area? Is it facing the viewer? Is it pushing away? It twists and turns and it clumps together, and you want to really pay attention to that when you're trying to create that look of realistic fur or hair. Really look at your reference photo. And I'm coming back and forth with violet, deep violet pencils and some lighter reddish orange tones in addition to that white pencil. But see how I start letting those bits of fur clump and cluster together. Now I want to overlap some of this into the background. Right now it was a bit too smooth from when I airbrushed it. And this is where that base that we did with the Inktense block, it saved a lot of time than if I had just done this all with the Inktense pencil. It could be done all with pencil or all with block. But combining the two, you just get really nice results. And they mix and blend into other colors very easily. So you're pretty safe getting, let's say you're on a budget. I would say instead of getting one huge or full set, I would get a smaller set of pencils and a smaller set of the blocks so that you can use them together, but you can mix so many colors from just a few. Now the fur on the body, I'm not going to put quite as much detailing into or as much contrast because I do want to set this back a little bit from the face. Well, I'm going to let that be part of what separates the body from the face is the texture in the fur. I've got a lot more detail, a lot tighter detail in that face, and then we'll just soften that out as we move on to the rest of the body. Now, one thing that I found to make areas, let's say I wanted something really black, as dark as I can get it, I will go through and do that first with the Inktense block, let it dry, and then go over it with the black Inktense pencil, and then of course blues and purples like I was talking about before, and that will get a lot darker than just the Inktense block. So that kind of goes back to where it's just really useful letting them work together. Now, what I did on here, you see a lot of the blue highlights. I don't know what happened to my video footage for that, but I took the blue Inktense block. If I had done this with the blue pencil, it just would have made those areas darker. You can see I've got it around the succulent, I've got it on the tail of the red panda, in the grass, some of his fur. And that's the same blue that I used in the sky, so this brings everything together nicely. But if I do that with just the pencil, like I said, going to get darker. So in this case, I can take the Inktense block and I applied that without mixing water, just dry, just drew that onto those areas. It does come out kind of rough, a little bit more textured, but it gives it a really cool look, and it's an easy way to get those definite blue, light blue highlights. Another option would have been to paint those. If I wanted it to be smooth and not have the texture, I could have painted those areas with the white Inktense block, painted all of those little details wherever I wanted it to be the light blue, let it dry, and then put a light blue, paint that over it. And that would have given me a more smooth look if you prefer that. And just for transparency, some of these Inktense were provided to me by Derwent, and then I had purchased quite a few more because I really like them. So I just want to throw that out there. It is my artwork on the newer Inktense tins. I've had the opportunity to work with Derwent on that, which was pretty exciting because, as you guys know, I absolutely love working with Derwent Inktense. So anyway, just a little disclaimer there. So now on to my watercolor adventures. I went ahead and purchased some Schmincke watercolors, half pans about, I don't know, I think it was in December, November. I've had them for a while. I hadn't had a chance to try them yet. So in order to really experiment with them and see what they could do, I came up with this design. I drew it on my Wacom tablet, and I figured this gave me a lot of different textures to play with and just a lot. Plus, I found it to be interesting. So I think that when you're learning a new medium, it's always more fun to paint something that you find to be really interesting. Like if you told me that I had to learn to paint watercolor by painting, I don't know, a foot, that doesn't interest me. So I don't think I would have had as much fun or been as excited about it. So I came up with a design that I was excited about that I thought would be a lot of fun. So this is the design that I started. Here is the start of me filling this in. I did a lot of experimenting, especially on the background, for getting different textures. So it's a bit of a mess right now, but you know, it's a part of the learning process. There is my easel, and I even made a little color chart for the colors that I have. My mess of watercolor, and I thought that this would be enough, but as always, when I try a new medium and I think it's a lot of fun, I think I need way more supplies. So I headed over to Dick Blick and Jerry's Artorama online and placed some ridiculous orders. Now, I am going to do a box opening once these come, but I started out thinking, well, I've got these tubes. I'll make myself some new half pans. I'll get a few more colors too. And so it seemed like not that ridiculous of a purchase. Some of you had recommended, or one of you guys recommended the Dr. Martens white bleed-proof white. So that is in there as well. And a few different paintbrushes. I've thrown that into it. So I thought that this would be the extent of my order for the weekend. And then it wasn't. So I had a friend message me with some brushes that she said I absolutely had to try. And then you guys had messaged me with or told me about a few brushes. I even threw some oil paint in there. So it's not just watercolor materials, but I wanted to try several different brushes. And the nice thing is, if I don't love the brushes for watercolor, it's not a big deal. I'll end up using them for something else. So it takes away some of that fear of trying brushes that I haven't seen in person or felt. I know that I'll use them for something, so they won't go to waste, which is good. Some of these brushes, the Creative Mark ones, I believe I bought those because I use them for acrylic blending. So some of these were not just for watercolor, well, like the Liquitex gesso that I was out of. So I did buy some things that weren't watercolor related. After this purchase, I thought, okay, I'm definitely done for the weekend. Then it was pointed out to me that I absolutely had to try some of these other brushes, the Winsor & Newton Series 7. So I threw those on there if I'm going to place the order. Now I've got all these brushes, may as well get a new brush holder. Threw that in there. And of course, the Canson Me 10s, you guys know I love. So I got a few pads of that since, you know, may as well save on shipping and get it all together. So really I'm saving money, right? By throwing more stuff in the cart. So those were my purchases for the weekend. Then I realized after all of that I forgot to buy white gouache. So I ended up just getting that from Amazon. But yeah, that was my weekend of spending way too much money on watercolor paint and supplies because I'm having so much fun with these. And realistically, I did not need to go buy all of those extra things. I mean, the 24 half pan set, that with a couple of colors, I added phthalo blue, phthalo green, and some white because we all know I'm not a proper watercolor artist. So I already had those. Really, I could have gotten away with just using those for a very long time, but I've been having so much fun, and I did have some budget to wiggle around with. I'm not wording that right, but budget to some wiggle room in my budget. That's how I'm trying to word that. I had wiggle room in my budget for art supplies where I could go ahead and order some stuff. So this is where I've left off at. I will be coming back through with some white gouache for some sparkly highlights on the frog and the tentacle that is closest to us on this octopus, but I will be finishing this guy off next week. He is already up on Patreon, or well, no, this portion will be up on Patreon later tonight, and then I will finish that for next week. I'm also considering, let me know what you think, I'm considering doing a damask background with a watercolor pencil over that dark blue. I'll have to try it out in Photoshop first to see if I like it, but I think it would look like really cool, old, worn, like stained, damaged wallpaper is the look that I thought would be neat. I don't know. I thought that might be a kind of cool addition to this. The background is pretty much a hot mess because I was experimenting. I don't usually, when I'm learning something new, I don't typically experiment on a separate piece of paper that much other than checking colors. I just jump into a project, and when I want to see what happens, I see what happens on the paper. So I'm not totally normal when it comes to my concept of trying new mediums. I just jump into a full project. I feel like I learn more that way, mostly because I'm having more fun. I just find it to be more interesting. But I thought that might make for a really neat base of a damask wallpaper type background. So I don't know. Let me know what you think. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going towards it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my new art videos every single week. You may also want to click on that bell notification icon because YouTube is horrible about notifying people now when new videos or live streams go up. You can also sign up for my free email newsletter where I also update you with new videos and my live stream schedule. I can't talk. That's nothing new.